Good afternoon. We are now going to call the committee to order. I will recognize myself now for 5 minutes for an opening statement. We are here today to talk about the incident that happened last week with the hospitals in Phoenix, Arizona that were hit by the, what I'm told is now being called extortionware campaign. I'm sure everyone now knows about this incident, but for those of you who are not, this did affect patient care in the larger Phoenix area. While we do not have solid numbers yet, it is anticipated that this did lead to fatalities. The government of Nevada was forced, wrong state. The government of Arizona was...
Please strike the last word.
Remember that for the record. The government of Arizona was forced to call a state of emergency, and FEMA, DHS, HHS were forced to respond to this incident. We are especially disturbed by reports that this incident was caused by known vulnerabilities within the hospital's network. We have several questions about why these vulnerabilities persisted and why they were able to infect the hospital network and what should have been done. While we did extend invitations to the administrators at the affected hospitals to come and explain to us and to the American people exactly what happened and how they plan to restore services and restore the faith of their patients, they declined. So instead, we will hear today from Mr. Jay Healey. He will talk to us about cybersecurity concerns and how we could have better prevented this, how we can prevent these things in the future. We're also going to hear from Trey, whose last name I don't know at the moment, to talk about 911 concerns, since, as you know, the 911 system was also affected. I will now recognize my ranking member, Alex Kryline, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
I'd like to thank the chair for her presiding over this committee hearing. It's been a tough few weeks. Very concerned about what we heard coming out of Arizona. A couple of reasons. First of all, one of our own members of this most august body, Senator John McCain, was involved in this incident, which is in itself very concerning. I'd also, though, echo the statements of the chairwoman for the concerns that these vulnerabilities were known yet still untreated. More than this, I think it's separately concerning that any threat actor or any organization or group was able to not only simply attack and decimate clearly the infrastructure security systems of hospitals, but also take 911 networks and infrastructure offline. These, as I understand it from my staffers who are all 19 to 24 years old and underpaid, are that these are homeland security and public safety networks, which I think begs a particularly specific question as to the responsibility for the operation and the security of these networks in an ongoing fashion. I think more than this, though, we have separate questions about the criminal conspiracy that obviously had to be undertaken by foreign actors or Americans. We still don't know as to their intentions, if this was an act of war, if this was a declaration of another kind. And this is really what this committee is attempting to provide some sort of level of scrutiny and oversight. More than this, though, I think it's also a separate question as to the responsibility of not just the hospitals, but to the inner workings of state and local governments and organizations as to what their appropriate role would be moving forward. So these are the types of things that we would like to try and investigate in this hearing. I'd now like to yield my time back to the chair so that we can take an opportunity to ask questions of these individuals.
I ask unanimous consent that the members' written opening statements be introduced into the record. Without objection, the documents will be entered into the record. I would now like to introduce our panel of witnesses for today's hearing. Mr. Jay Healey and Mr. What is your last name?
Trey Fogarty.
Trey Fogarty. Thank you all for being here today and providing testimony. We look forward to hearing about the incident that happened last week and how we can do better. All right. Mr. Jay Healey, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Wilkerson, Ranking Member, members of the committee. Thank you for the time to testify in front of you today, especially in light of the recent extortionware attacks on hospitals in Arizona. My comments were prepared beforehand on cybersecurity generally, but I will include points relative to that incident. While I've not yet fully determined who was responsible, there has been speculation this was a nation state, perhaps in response to U.S. policies or even past U.S. cyber attacks. My experience in research at Columbia University is leading me to believe that cyber conflict may be the most escalatory kind of conflict ever. Much of this is tied to the tactical and technical dynamics of cyber conflict, themselves rooted in the fundamental properties of the internet. My colleague at Columbia University, Bob Jervis, argued many, many years ago, a security dilemma where competing nations compete in a spiraling escalation is doubly dangerous if the offense is dominant over defense and it is hard to distinguish the two. If this were the case, he wrote, arms races could easily occur and incentives to strike first could turn crises into war. Unfortunately, the internet and connected systems are not only distinguished by those two characteristics of offense dominance and difficulty of distinguish offense and dominance. Cyber conflict is even more escalatory than that, as it is also hard to distinguish offense from either espionage or intelligence preparation of the battlefield. Cyber conflict also has low barrier to entry, and perhaps most importantly, capabilities are not just stockpiled, but actually used all the time in unattributed, covert, gray zone attacks, as it appears that we saw recently in Arizona. Cyberspace may not just be doubly dangerous, as he wrote, but perhaps quintuply dangerous or worse. Pushing militarized ideas like deterrence might only escalate things farther, rather than being a starting point for stability. Indeed, it is very hard to find any examples of nations being deterred when they see other nations building or employing cyber capabilities. But there are mounds of evidence that they instead watch, learn, build their own capabilities, and counterattack when they can. So I believe that in part because of the fundamental properties of the internet, cyber conflict may be the most escalatory kind of conflict that warfare has ever invented since we first picked up stone and stick against one another. Fortunately, those fundamental properties may not all be so fundamental, and I think that does give us hope in the face of what we've been facing recently. Of course, it is true that some properties of the internet could never change. We cannot imagine some alternate internet that did not, for example, operate at the speed of light or was not a scale-free network. However, we can imagine one where attribution is far easier, and indeed many have worked patiently for years to help bring this about. This is not built into the physics of the internet, just an emergent property of the network as it exists today. So it also does not have to be the case that the internet, by way of physics, must inevitably give the bulk of the advantage to the offense. We can, and indeed we must, work towards a more defensible internet to give the defender, not the attacker, the high ground. I'm executive director of a New York cyber task force that has just convened on this topic. Our task force is now finalizing our report, and in front of you I've given a small booklet of our findings so far. I'm sure our co-chairs, Phil Venable of Goldman Sachs and Greg Rattray of JP Morgan, and my dean at Columbia, Merritt Janow, will be happy for me to share our draft report with you and your staff so you can see our thinking in detail. I think our report covers much of the same ground as your committee is. First, why hasn't cyberspace more defensible? Why is it that hospitals and others have so many unpatched territory? Every cybersecurity professional has their own reason on why cyberspace is not more defensible. We've compiled 13, from the internet was never designed for security, to persistent software weaknesses and the lack of a cohesive strategy. Second, the task force looked at what past innovations have made the most impact at least cost. And these are on the inside 2 pages of your booklet. Through research, interviews, and the expert opinions of our task force members, we've identified dozens of important innovations since the 1960s. Critically, we collected not just technological innovations, such as firewalls, but operational and policy innovations as well, and distinguished between those that were point solutions, such as firewalls that might protect a single company, to those that work across all cyberspace, such as Windows Update or the Budapest Convention or London process. Third, we identified a number of common factors and lessons from these, but they can be both summarized in a single word, leverage. The best innovations of the past 50 years gave the defenders the most advantage over attackers and did so easily or automatically across the entire internet. Fourth, applying these lessons, we've identified several promising future innovations and recommendations. Personally, I have to say how surprised I was with the very strong consensus that we have not yet begun to see the full security benefits of further cloud development. I was not surprised to see the recommendations to push for more transparency to better align market incentives. I think given that what we've seen in Arizona, both of those kinds of recommendations about leverage that are also tied to potential more cloud development and transparency to help align market incentives will make a much more significant difference. The task force believes a defensible internet is possible by applying leverage. Perhaps a cyber moonshot or Manhattan Project could help, but let us not underestimate the patient application of the right kind of innovation following a strategy of leverage. Thank you very much. I look forward to any comments or questions.
The gentleman yields back his time. We now recognize Mr. Trey Fogarty for 5 minutes to enter his testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Wilkerson and Ranking Member Kryline. I appreciate your holding this hearing today. I've submitted my written testimony for the record, and so if it pleases the committee, I'd like to just briefly summarize this morning. First, anytime we have an incident like what we faced last week in the 911 community, there is not a question about whether there exists a potential for harm. Our business is life and death on every call. When an enemy, a criminal enterprise, or an adversary, whether foreign or domestic, launches an attack against our nation's 911 infrastructure, there can be no question that the impact will be extraordinary. I appreciate your bringing attention to this issue because our nation's 911 infrastructure is aging. And as it does so, vulnerabilities that previously were protected by virtue of legacy infrastructure are becoming exposed to attackers on the internet and on other networks that interface directly or indirectly with our 911 systems. The old structures that have protected us for a long period of time are simply no longer good enough. And we have to begin work now to empower our state, local, territorial, and tribal personnel to defend their networks and systems against these emerging threats. I'd like to briefly mention the important work going on at the Department of Commerce and the National Highway Transport Safety Administration, the National 911 Office, with the Department of Commerce, their efforts around FirstNet and other public safety communications, particularly with the Department of Homeland Security and their Office of Emergency Communications. And I would like to just point out that as our infrastructure ages, it's going to become more and more imperative that we transition to an all IP-based next generation 911 system. While there are certainly those who will say that making this transition will open us up to new internet age vulnerabilities, the reality is it also gives us the ability to leverage new types of defense that in the legacy telephone network we simply do not have. Madam Chair, I appreciate your holding this hearing. I invite your questions, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Fogarty, I'm a little confused because you were just saying that it's imperative that we move to an IP-based network, but it seems like with what happened in Arizona, that moving to a more connected infrastructure actually puts us in a worse position to be able to handle incidents like this. So how do you explain moving to a more IP-based connected 911 system with what happened in Arizona?
I think the most important thing, Madam Chair, is the ability that we have to defend against attacks. In the legacy telephone network, when we have an attacker launching a distributed denial of service attack against telephone infrastructure, our ability to absorb or deflect that traffic is essentially zero. The average 911 center has fewer than 24 trunks. These are basically telephone lines that allow us to handle 911 calls. When we reach a queue depth or a number of waiting calls that goes beyond about 23 or 24 in a well-provisioned center, we simply cannot accept any more calls. And it's not like there is another layer of the network in advance of that to handle that. In the IP world, while we certainly will have new and different types of vulnerabilities, we'll also have the ability to do things like DNS black holing, traffic diversion, traffic cleaning, and even traffic marking. So we can say, look, this traffic appears to be suspicious because of where it came from, who it came from, and whether or not we have an authentication for it. And then we can divert that potentially to non-human resources to determine before we handle the call, is this legitimate?
Okay. Mr. Healey, in your testimony to us, I didn't hear a lot of focus on figuring out who was responsible. It seems to me that would be a very important part of this conversation. So, with what happened in Arizona, I think we're still talking to the FBI, obviously. We're still talking to DHS. We're talking to our intelligence community, and we're not sure yet. But why wouldn't we want to focus more on finding and punishing those responsible? Wouldn't that actually make us safer?
I think that is correct. And one of the things that we've found as we've been doing our research is the operational and policy responses, such as attribution and holding people responsible, are harder for the attackers to circumvent. When we put a new device on the network and we expect to get the protection from that, that becomes relatively easy for the bad guys to bypass. The operational and policy tools that we put in place, we tend to get longer leverage out of because the attackers can't circumvent that so easily. Where I think we've done poorly in the past, and I think much testimony to this committee has been talking more generally about deterrence. And when we have something like this where we say, if this, for example, is confirmed to be tied to a specific country, looking like we did for China in commercial espionage and having specific remedies tied to specific activity that we want to see stopped, and we've tended to see more success from those kinds of policy and operational interventions.
Okay. Well, and I'll open this up to the panel. How could we have possibly had this happen? How could something like a known vulnerability actually shut down patient care? This seems completely unacceptable that these kinds of events could take place. I mean, I just don't understand, and I don't think the members of the other members sitting on the dais with me would really understand how this could possibly have occurred. So what happened? How did we get here?
So if I can take that first, Madam Chair, I think the thing I would like to emphasize is, in the abstract, you're absolutely correct. A known vulnerability with an available patch should be patched. The reality when you start getting into systems that affect the real world, and particularly, I don't want to speak for Mr. Healey, but particularly in our business in the 911 space, or I assume in the hospital space, where you have devices that interact with patients or other systems, patching is not always as simple as a do it immediately sort of thing. In many cases, you have to deal with what is the potential impact on an operating system that may be attached to a human or some other device. We certainly see this in the physical infrastructure world. Having said that, we certainly believe in the 911 space that there is more we can do to encourage, number one, vendors to support high-cost capital items that have lifetimes measured in years or tens of years, to continue to support those devices over the full life cycle that they have. And number two, to put in place policy responses that can encourage both vendors and users to apply available patches when that becomes necessary.
Mr. Healey, I'm going to run out of time, but please respond.
Yeah, thank you. I see two general areas that we came through in our New York Cyber Task Force. First comes down to complexity. And the systems are becoming so absolutely complex and our adversaries are so advanced that it becomes difficult for any normal size organization to be able to try and keep them out, especially if it turns out in this case it was terrorists or a nation state. Also, if I can quote two colleagues here, one Dan Gear, who said the enemy of security, or the opposite of security isn't insecurity, it's convenience. And that's what we've seen in many, many cases of it improves patient care, it simplifies our lives when we end up adding more to the network that we can. If I can quote another one of my colleagues, Joshua Cormier, said, if you can't protect, don't connect. And we've done for so often just connecting these systems in. And we see places where smart regulation or other rules can come in to align the market incentives in such cases. For example, the SEC guidance, where if a company has a materially significant breach, they have to tell their shareholders. That's a transparency measure that then allows a lot of other market incentives to come into place. Shareholder lawsuits, reporting in the 10Q, insurance, and that's all allowed by transparency. And so I'd like to see what we can do out of this wake-up call to see what we can more transparency. Thank you.
My time has expired. I now recognize my ranking member for 5 minutes to ask questions.
I'd like to ask for you. Before I begin, I'd like to ask unanimous consent for this report to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. So ordered. I have a number of questions that I'd like to go through with you. These are in the form of yes or no statements. I'm not So, Mr. Healey, for you, I have 5 questions. The first one is, were these vulnerabilities known prior to the exploitation to the hospitals that were affected?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. Were the vulnerabilities introduced in software that had been previously used and vetted by said hospitals?
I'm not trying to answer the question, but I'll say yes.
Okay. How is it possible then, this is not a yes or no question, that these were systems that were used in production in high availability networks for critical circumstances that were knowingly vulnerable, that had not been patched. And separately from that, how is it possible that a hospital is allowed to procure infrastructure without any requirements for software development lifecycle security?
I wish the hospital executives were here to answer that own question and what they're able to handle. From my perspective in seeing this in finance sector and other places, there's certainly issue of both cost and patient care. A lot of times you get better outcomes by connecting these, and you would be negligent not to connect them if it is going to lead to better outcomes and lower costs, especially when they're being squeezed. However, as you note, it brought up critical insecurities that they ended up paying for in the long run.
So back to some yes or no questions. Do we know who the actual attackers were?
No, we do not, is my understanding.
Okay. And are you aware of any organizations who are taking any sort of extenuating measures to ensure that we don't have the same type of attack on what was a United States senator?
I'm still not sure if we've confirmed. If confirmed, we know that the senator was affected by this. I don't believe from having what we've seen in the reporting that was confirmed yet. I can only assume that the National Security Council and Homeland Security Council, I would assume Tom Bossert would be in the lead on that as the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, is leading an interagency process with the NSC and HSC members. I believe that's coming up to a principals committee in the coming week. We'll have the secretaries of the HSC and the NSC coming up with recommendations for the president.
Madam Chairman, I think that we should move that in the very near future we have a convening meeting either on the record or off the record with those individuals that were mentioned by Mr. Healey. Mr. Fogarty, I'd like to turn to you for a few questions. Did any of the systems that were affected in the 911 infrastructure receive public money?
Yes. As a matter of fact, nearly every 911 system around the country, including those that were affected, receive funding from the state and local 911 fees that are collected for these purposes. Now, I will mention in the state of Arizona's case, there is a lengthy history of diverting 911 fees to other purposes. And in fact, Arizona has been one of the states that has used tens of millions of 911 dollars to fill gaps in their general fund.
So a follow-on question to that. So just to be clear, we're taking public money, we're providing that to infrastructure for a public safety and homeland security purpose. And is it my understanding that we're doing that without the requirement that they follow security best practices?
It is correct, Congressman. There are no requirements that.
How is it possible that that's the case?
So historically, 911 has been a state and exclusively state and local function. The federal government has had a very limited role in our nation's emergency response infrastructure. And in general, the states and localities have not necessarily had, in part because of the sort of telephone network history that I mentioned in my opening statement, have not had a need to secure their, or at least have not believed that they had a need to secure their infrastructure in the way other critical infrastructure providers have. The other thing I would mention is our nation faces a critical cyber workforce gap. At the state and local level in particular, we do not have an availability of trained, competent people to manage and secure these networks. And I would also add, in the commercial sector, we do not have vendors selling into that marketplace. If my members want to buy security products tomorrow, they would have a very difficult time doing so.
So is there any funding that comes from any federal government organizations like the Department of Homeland Security or others?
The federal government has provided funding to 911 centers on only 2 occasions for their 911 related purposes. Mm-hmm. Once was $40 million in the early 2000s timeframe. There is $115 million currently pending. We are on the record.
But there's no requirement that any of that money be spent on infrastructure that is somehow inherently secure or not. Is that an evaluative criterion in the ability to make these grants and to receive these money, or are we just taking money and setting it on fire and giving it to the Russians?
That is not currently a criteria, Congressman. However, we would certainly support the inclusion of the security criteria because of this incident.
So you would support cutting off funding to organizations who aren't secure then?
Yes.
I'd yield my time.
Gentleman yields back the remainder of his time. Are there other members wishing to receive recognition to ask questions? The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Boy, I don't know any of the syntax here, but thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for recognizing my questions. This question is directed towards, I think, anyone, really. Sorry, no, it's not. It's directed towards Mr. Healey. The hospitals in question that the extortionware was attacking. So it sounds like there were questions that they knew there were vulnerabilities, they knew there were patches. They were not mitigated before the extortionware hit. What role do the providers of the medical equipment play in securing the equipment that the hospitals are operating? Is it the hospitals or the HDO's responsibility? Or where's the boundary between the device vendor or manufacturer's responsibility?
Congressman, I do have to apologize that I'm not an expert on hospital IT systems, so I'm afraid I'm unable to answer your question.
That sounds satisfying. Welcome to Congress.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
I thought I was just someone in the audience. Sorry, Mr. Trey.
Fogarty.
Do you have an answer to that question for any reason?
So while I certainly wouldn't want to speak for the hospital space because I don't have experience there, what I can tell you is within the 911 space, deciding exactly where responsibility for security and patching lies can be a devilishly tricky thing. Just because one of my members has in their center a $5 million piece of equipment that handles 911 calls made by a company, let's say Airbus, that device might be attached to a network sold to the 911 center, the PSAP, by AT&T. It might be serviced by a software vendor. And the contract that deals with all of it may be with a systems integrator. And so the thing that we've run into repeatedly, whether it's been on naturally caused outages or man-made outages, is we often get into a circular firing squad situation where everyone claims it's someone else's responsibility and the contract documents don't specify who's correct. And so that's something where we've been working with the FCC and others to try and develop some sort of framework to sort out who's on first and what's on second when we have an outage. So our members at least know who to call about, okay, how do we fix it? Now, the second step of that is, okay, how do we patch it in the first place? And I don't think we're there yet, but it is something that we're starting to think about.
And if I can, Congressman, I'd be very curious if I were looking, as we look more deeply into this event, you've got a trade-off between convenience, patient safety, cost, and the negative implications that can happen when you do have a security incident like this. That's okay. Board directors, CEOs, executives, they're getting paid to make these trade-offs between how we look at these. And so what I like to see in an enterprise is, do they have that risk structure that looks at, that's picking up these governance questions and examining them and going through them. And those that do not do that, it is perhaps more acceptable to, if you don't mind the phrase, blame the victim, because they didn't even have the governance process in place to say, we have this patch, but if we patch this, then it might put our patients in short-term risk. If they are going through that process and they're making those kinds of decisions and saying, well, we'll budget for this and we'll take care of this, and they have a structure, that makes me feel much better that they've got this under control. And I think it'll be interesting as we see more reporting from those hospital executives and others on where they came down in addressing those conversations between the board, the executives, and the IT staff.
The gentleman yields back his time. Are there other members seeking recognition to ask questions? The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Pennsylvania.
Damn it. You give me that information.
Grew up in New Jersey, live in Pennsylvania. So regarding the 911 system, what I'm hearing is there are major issues with patching systems we know are vulnerable and fixing them. There are issues with hiring or even finding staff to support security. what are we doing to solve these challenges? So I keep hearing about all the problems we're facing, but what are we actually going to do to fix them so we don't have the same conversation 5 years from now?
I appreciate the question, Congressman. To answer, I'll take those, if I can, in the reverse order. First off, we have been advocating consistently for several years now that we need a major injection of federal capital to move our nation over to next generation 911 systems now rather than later. The commercial networks that our 911 systems depend upon are making that transition quickly. Most plan to have it completed by the end of the year 2020 or 2021. If we don't get this done now, the ability of attackers to originate more traffic than we can ever possibly absorb in our 911 systems is only going to grow, and it's going to grow to a point where there's simply no way to defend at all anymore. So that's number one. We need that injection of federal capital, and we need federal assistance with securing these networks, frankly. To address the workforce problem, I'm a member of the FCC's Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. And in last year's report, we actually addressed the workforce issues facing our state, local, territorial, and tribal governments with hiring security personnel. One thing that I think is sort of low-hanging fruit that we ought to look at is how can we identify IT and security talent early and provide pathways to careers that are not necessarily dependent upon four-year degrees. We have lots of very talented and capable security professionals that do not have degrees and who nonetheless go on to great careers. Those are exactly the kinds of folks that we're looking for in state, local, territorial, and tribal governments, and it's something that the federal government can work to encourage.
And if I may, this has been the central question our New York Cyber Task Force has been focusing on. And our answer, again, if I can repeat the word, comes down to leverage, right? So many of our security solutions have focused on, here's a new attack type, let us develop a new device. And on the other side of town here, we have many people that are going to be there and they will help you to have one of those devices that they will sell you to deal with this specific attack. And that's led to this incredible complexity that leads to situations like we saw in the hospitals where you've got to patch everything and you've got all these more complexity that you can handle. So we need to do what we can to subtract that complexity out. So we've been looking at a range of the kinds of solutions that, for example, take the user out of the solution so that we're not depending on someone and a user doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing or not doing the wrong thing to get through. Taking away entire classes of attacks. We've been fascinated to see that, for example, things like formal methods are coming back, that DARPA and Microsoft are looking for provably secure software that when I was studying was only something in the lab, and they're now bringing in to secure things like HTTPS using these formal methods. And by doing that, you're taking on entire classes of attacks. So we're really interested in these places where vendors can themselves make a solution. Jeff Moss, one of my colleagues, he's on the New York Cyber Task Force, he talks about there's probably maybe 20 vendors. And if you can get them to change just a couple of defaults each, that we have fundamentally transformed where we are in cybersecurity.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to seek recognition to ask questions?
In one of your previous responses, you had discussed the trade-off for patient safety. I was wondering, when you're not in a wartime situation, what is an acceptable level to trade off patient safety?
Congressman, I have to say I have not been in the healthcare space, and that's such a difficult conversation. And really, that's much of what we're seeing now in the healthcare debate is how much are we spending on patients? My background was in finance, government and finance sector. And so there we had a very different risk governance model where we had, for example, if a managing director in the fixed income division wanted to keep running SUNAS, the CISO could say, that is okay. You need to run that. You're making $5 million on that. That is absolutely okay with me. Sign this waiver approving this, and this is going to go to the risk committee, and it will get signed off by the CEO. No problem. And what do you know? All of a sudden, it wasn't critical anymore, and they spent the money to upgrade that software because they didn't want to be the one to go to the CEO to have sign off on their waiver and why they were imposing that risk on the rest of the firm. And that's what I mean. I want to see those governance structures that tackle these tough questions that are imposed. We're having these tough choices. And it's much tougher in healthcare, and I don't envy them those choices, but they're healthcare executives and they have to deal with those kinds of questions day in, day out, I'm sure.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairwoman. I would like to ask the members of the panel to elaborate a bit on our earlier statement. You expressed support for tying federal funding of hospitals and 911 systems to the implementation of security best practices. If this were to be done, what would be like who would have regulatory control of that? Would that be the FDA, HHS? Who in your proposed scenario would actually be controlling the flow of funds?
So I appreciate your question, Congressman. We have consistently advocated for grant-based oversight and not regulation. As I stated previously, we have a strong history of state, local, territorial, and tribal governments managing their own 911 systems with little to no actual federal regulatory authority over them, other than in the case of some labor-related issues. We're very comfortable with that model. Our state and local members are certainly very comfortable with that model. What we do have also a successful history of, however, are grant programs that use a carrot approach rather than a stick. So historically, when we've been looking to do things like encourage the adoption of wireless E911 capabilities, so basically the ability to locate people when they call 911 from a mobile device, we have seen the Departments of Commerce and Transportation condition grant funding on recipients prioritizing that money for deployment of that capability. So I could certainly envision a grant scenario where grant funding was conditioned upon or prioritized for the deployment of security capabilities, the improvement of security capabilities. And to address the previous Congressman's question, I think one thing we certainly should consider how to include is support for workforce development when it comes to our security needs.
And if I may add on to that, excellent answer on how you're looking at that. In general, in my conversations with Trump administration officials, as well as the current executive order, anything they're looking to do on security standards, whether it's in government through the regulatory agencies, is aligning on the NIST cybersecurity framework. They're really doubling down on the cybersecurity framework within the finance sector. They were looking to do harmonization across regulators so that they'll be more strictly on what NIST has put out.
And if I might just mention very briefly, because it is relevant, in the 911 space, we actually do have a security standard called Security for Next Generation 911 Systems. It's known as NGSEC. Even though it talks about next generation systems, that standard can be applied today. It was actually completed in its initial form before the NIST framework was first published. The FCC did a review of that subsequently and determined that even though our standards developers didn't know what the NIST framework would be, the two documents were extraordinarily well aligned. So they actually asked us if we got an advanced copy of it. And the answer is no, but I think that's a good thing to say, that we have a pathway that tells us in a form that is more familiar to the 911 profession what to do.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to ask questions? The gentleman from New Hampshire is recognized.
So I have two questions. One, is it true that the internet is a series of tubes? And separately, I find the testimonies quite cavalier and concerning. This is a public safety issue that took out hospitals, crisis confidence. Our phones are ringing off the hook if this is going to happen to us. This sounds like normal risk management, mumbo jumbo, volunteer stuff from the private sector. This is a matter of public safety. This is a matter of national security. What is it going to take for us to stop rolling the dice and gambling with 1/6 of our economy in healthcare?
To some degree, I think that's up to this chamber I think the advice from the experts has been relatively consistent over the past 15 years. As a matter of fact, I was in front of one of the House subcommittees in 1991, June 25th or so in 1991, that one of my colleagues, Win Schwartau, 65th birthday party tonight, first talked about a coming digital Pearl Harbor. And so that has been 26 of the 76 years since the actual Pearl Harbor. So I do agree with you, Congressman, that the warning has been ample, and we do look forward to working with you on solutions so that this is the last time we talk about what we will do, and we're talking more about what we have done.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition?
Cutting the budget on vice chair.
The gentleman is recognized.
So you mentioned in your opening statement that offense has the upper hand always, but I've yet to hear a good solution to how we flip the switch. And otherwise, it seems like we're just playing whack-a-mole and chasing our own tail. So what are the first biggest bang for bucks that we could do to start actually giving hospitals, which I see as symptomatic of the accrual of technical debt? How do we start alleviating the burden at the hospital level as opposed to burdening them with becoming security experts?
Thank you very much, Congressman. And I wouldn't necessarily, if I just as a clarification, wouldn't say, oh, the offense always has. There's many cases. I was just talking with a colleague today that talked about, for example, if you're, there are many hard targets. He gave the example of a military target, adversary air defense, where the defenders have all sorts of advantages. But they usually have the advantage, especially for general internet-connected systems. And so what we've been doing as far as our New York Cyber Task Force, and again, I'm happy to leave a copy of our book with you, is as we've been going through, we've been saying we need to get the market incentives to better aligned, and I've spoken to that in some of my comments. For example, if we're going to regulate, rather than regulating for security, regulating for transparency. The SEC guidance, I think, is an excellent example of this. If I could convince one person in the world to take security seriously, I only mean this part tongue-in-cheek. It wouldn't be any current or past president. It's not anyone in Silicon Valley. I would start with Warren Buffett. Because if we got Warren Buffett to say, I will use the NIST cybersecurity framework in all of my companies, and I will not invest in a company if I think the intellectual property has walked out the door. We will be on the front page of every financial newspaper for ages. And every board director of every publicly traded company in the world, and that's hardly an exaggeration, is going to be saying, what the fuck is a NIST cybersecurity framework? But we're forcing them to pay attention to it, and that's getting the market incentives to work. If I could follow up with some other group, I might go to the California pension system, CalPERS, continue through Omaha right to Sacramento. Before Y2K, the California pension system, which runs trillions, went to all of the companies that they invest in and said, what are you doing for Y2K? If we can get activist investors, such as CalPERS, to go and say to their companies at their shareholder meetings, what are you doing to protect us so that we're not another Yahoo? What do you do? Are you using the NIST cybersecurity framework? That scales better than what we're doing, and it's getting these market incentives to align. In the rest of our report, which is going to be part of the record, we have other ideas. Where we did not get consensus as part of the Cyber Task Force, and frankly, as an executive director, I did not even try and push. In some of these ideas like transparency, they're easy to propose because at the end of the day, we're not saying who pays. We're not creating winners and losers. There's another set of solutions, such as liabilities for software vendors, for not allowing ISPs to pass the trash, for more extreme transparency measures, where you're really going to take significant hits on innovation, where you're going to be creating winners and losers based on the policies. And in those places, I don't think that on our side as researchers, we've done a good enough job to say, all right, if we're going to take a hit on innovation in the United States, are we going to get more security bang for the buck if we do software liability or if we have ISPs crack down? And I think until we do that, it's tougher to try and figure out where best to do that, although I understand some other members of this chamber might have their own ideas on that.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, panelists. You've been very patient in during our what must be for you very, very simple questions. The question I have is, let's suppose that this is a nation state. I've got one that I like to pick on, but I won't name them. What options do we have to retaliate against them, and how will that deter them?
If I may, if I can just start with, say, one country, I'll say Russia. The options are probably a little bit better than for some other countries. With North Korea, we have very few good options left. The policy toolbox is only so big, and we've used just about every tool that's in there. With Russia, we have a little bit wider set of tools that we can use. It's worth considering that it is possible, I don't think it's probable, but it's at least possible, that the Russian election interference of 2016 was Putin's payback for the release of the Panama Papers, which he believes was, perhaps correctly, was a U.S. covert action. So we need to be very careful when we're talking about cyber deterrence and what we're going to do back. Deterrence works very differently when your adversary is certain that they're punching you back, not punching you first. That said, with Putin, it's clear that he respects strengths, and in this case, some brushback pitches are certainly called for. With Congress in the midst of passing sanctions, we take that as a very good sign, and we hope that the EU sanctions, which are in place now until June 2018, I believe, are held in place. Personally, I know this is not necessarily germane to this body. I'm very curious of what about Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, is going to do next. Her own elections are coming up in September of 2017, and she has to assume that Putin would be willing to spend an awful lot of money to try and get her out of power. I recommend that we have a NATO Article 4 consultation. This isn't the self-defense article of NATO. This is a consultation to say that we are facing an external threat to our security, which certainly Putin has done. Other things for the United States against Putin range from everything from sanctions to more kinetic, certainly more military exercise, generating more force with our NATO allies, reinforcing the Baltics, and the like, so that Putin knows that we are not intimidated and we will not allow this.
If I could add just two things, Congressman, I think from the perspective of the broader international community, there are two problems that have to be confronted at some point. One is the problem of proportionality in cyberspace. I don't think we yet have a global consensus on how proportionality principles that are relatively well understood in the kinetic space transfer to the non-physical world of the internet. Now, there are cases where that may be a little bit more certain, where we are dealing with cyber events that have kinetic effects. So an attack on a power grid, for example, that destroys rotating equipment would be one example. I do think there are steps that the international community can take, and there are steps that the United States can take as a prominent member of the international community. Much the way we stated specific reservations to the Law of the Sea Treaty, but nonetheless made enforceable commitments about how we would behave under certain circumstances when we refused to sign on to LOST. We could certainly make unilateral declarations about how we intend to behave and how we will regard the behavior of other states. This is one way that we can start to relatively quickly build a body of customary international law with respect to norms in cyberspace. The other thing that I would say is there may be a role for the World Court. I raise that very hesitantly, but we do have one case, from 1996 in the legality of use or threat of use case with respect to nuclear weapons. in which the Security Council referred a specific narrow question to the court for resolution. And that question, their answer to that, has guided international policy with respect to the use of nuclear weapons for some decades now. That is an option. It is not necessarily the first option that I would encourage us to pursue, but it is certainly one that can be thought about.
And if I can follow up on my previous answer, Congressman, and I agree very much with my colleagues, much will depend as we continue to get the reporting from this incident and how many deaths that we'd found. There'd been many deaths from the failure of industrial control systems and the like, but from my research, no one had ever died directly from a cyber attack yet. So if deaths are confirmed from these, they will be the first that we can tell that have come from a hack, if you will. And that puts us in extremely different territory, especially when it comes to international law and what other nations will see as valuable for this. So I think it's incumbent on the executive branch to help determine how many people had been killed and to not be shy about declassing evidence about who was behind this. Especially if this does turn out to have been a nation state, I think declassification for other things that nation state has done. Russia has been pointed out in the press of, for example, not just doing hacks against, for example, the email of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but actually putting implants into nuclear power plants in the United States and Europe. Citizens that might be blasé about hacking an election are probably going to be less blasé about knowing that Russian agents have burrowed into the systems of the nuclear plant that's just upriver. It gives us a lot of additional options, not just the one that my colleague talked about, but for example, the Department of Justice has already indicted Russian hackers, but for hacking. Actually, not just Russian hackers, but Russian intelligence officers. But they were under hacking rules. Now, if it looks like the worst does come out, they now have indictments under homicide. And that puts us in a very different position when it overseas, and I think it strengthens the president's hand considerably, should he choose to use it.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? You're out of time. Time has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired.
All my time.
Yes, we did.
Gotta get my paperwork in order. In conclusion, I'd like to thank all of the witnesses and members that participated in today's hearing. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask that all witnesses agree to respond promptly to the questions. With that, this committee hearing is adjourned.
Yay.
So I wasn't entirely sure how I Am the Cavalry wanted to wrap up this particular talk, but if it wasn't clear, I am actually a congressional staffer. I do these kinds of things for a living. So if anybody don't laugh. Alex is making fun of me.
I'm not.
If anyone has any questions about this process, what happened, what was going on, I'm happy to answer any of them, or these guys can instruct what comes next.
Or not.
All right, everyone gets how Congress works.
Yeah. No. Other questions?
It's got to be questions.
So,
We don't have to.
I wonder. So, I wonder.
He's got a mic.
Doug. I wonder just quickly, going around the room, how do you think you would have responded if you were in the hot seat? Does anybody wanted to volunteer for this that didn't get a chance to be in the hot seat? How do you think Jay and Trey did? Really well.
It's tough. I mean, it's tough. You guys are tough.
And that's not by accident. They've both been in front of a much tougher audience than this relatively friendly group, answering some very hard questions about cybersecurity issues on the actual Hill. Doug, did you have a question or a point you wanted to make?
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm on. Yes.
Yeah.
I've never testified, but I've worked with and for a bunch of people who have testified. The sort of question is, a lot of times in the hearing, something will come out which seems an obvious, yes, there is a problem and there is some sort of a solution. What are the cogs and wheels that turn after we get off the stage that are why things do or do not happen from this point on when you have that sort of a setup and slam dunk. And yet still, I mean, I'm not going to get into like why we can't make forward progress, but like assume we were going to try and do something. What happens after the scene is closed? How does progress then come from this?
So there are a couple of different ways that progress can be made. It depends on whether or not it needs a legislative fix. So if you need a bill, if you need a new law, that's obviously a lot more complicated. And usually what happens then is you've brought in experts to testify to kind of give you an idea of what that bill language should say to get to the policy that you want. So then theoretically speaking, the next process is that you're going to go and you're going to work with legislative counsel who are lawyers who specialize in writing legislative language, and you're going to draft it. Then you're going to talk to all the members who are involved. You're going to have a legislative hearing. You're going to have a markup. You're going to get it to a subcommittee. Then you go to the committee. So the legislative process is a whole big long thing, and very complicated. Legislation is a beast that I don't usually deal with because it is so hard to get right. There are other ways that Congress can affect change with oversight hearings. Usually what you're doing is you're not necessarily going out to try and do legislation. You're trying to identify a problem and trying to sort of get to the bottom of what happened in the kind of situation. So if we were having a hearing in response to the cyber crisis simulation that we had before, it would likely be an oversight hearing, not a legislative hearing. So you'd have people testifying under oath, and it essentially would be in interrogation. You'd be sitting there and you'd be saying, what happened, what went wrong, and if you're under oath and you say something that isn't correct, I mean, you've just committed a federal crime. So that the oversight investigations can be pretty intense. And in those cases, sometimes it was a crime committed, and then what happens, and sometimes with investigations, oversight and investigations hearings, the goal is to then identify an issue, and sometimes it moves to legislation, sometimes it doesn't. But Congress is a pretty tough beast. A lot of the times, you can have. Usually, we'll try to have as many meetings as you can with as many people as you can to try and explain your view of the world and see if there's ways to make progress. But it's hard. I don't know.
So if I can just mention a couple of practical things that I usually like to think about. So if I'm walking into a hearing, I generally want to know two things that I want to come out of it. So one example might be if I want the chair and ranking member to write a letter to an agency head or a component head or something like that to say, how are you doing, explain to us how you're doing X and how you're going to prioritize Y and how you're going to fix Z. The agency heads do actually read those. They feel very strongly that they have to comply and answer and so forth.
Required to comply most of the times.
Yeah, they usually have to. Other things that I could think about doing is, a change potentially, if it's something small, if an agency's up for reauthorization, a language tweak. Or maybe in their annual appropriation statute, I want something prioritized differently. I can go after it that way. If it's something smaller, I might even just want a committee staffer or a member staffer to call somebody up and say, hey, what are you guys doing about this? Because sometimes that's enough to fix, a small thing if that's all you're after.
Yeah, I'd say so I Jessica and I have different experiences because I worked in a personal office for about 4.5 years, and she works on committee. And so, quite frankly, people take her more seriously than they took me for all sorts of reasons. But the part of the issue is you want to be able to get the members of Congress themselves somewhat incentivized to do things. The challenge, though, is Congress is to a very large extent binary. Either you did or you didn't pass something. Then there's the convening power of Congress and the public shaming power of Congress, which can be very powerful. But ultimately, most of the decision-making that influences outcomes is Congress telling other departments and agencies what to do, right? So they usually do that through the federal budget process or through an appropriations process. But it's really different when it's a private company, right? Congress has almost zero authority over private companies. Now, what they can do, unless they broke the law, and they can't change the law and then say, we changed the law now, and so you broke the law we changed now 2 years ago. You can't retroactively do that. It's unconstitutional. But one of the other pieces that they can do, and that they on occasion will do, is they will work with federal departments and agencies to pressure those companies to make certain types of decisions and outcomes. But it's really uncertain whether that's effective or not. It's totally a non-transparent process.
And if I could add one thing, because you said something that I certainly didn't understand when I came to D.C. at first. And I don't know what, just to level set here, I don't know how much experience everybody has with this, but in Congress, there are sort of 4 types of staff. You have a member's personal office staff. So if I'm the gentleman from Tennessee, I have, X number of people who work for me, who staff me. A committee has a professional staff that works that committee. It actually has 2, one for each party. And they sort of represent the interests of the committee. They work on, the legislation's markups, things like that, research, et cetera. Then you have leadership offices. So, for example, Paul Ryan's the Speaker of the House. The Speaker has an office with a staff that is not the gentleman from Wisconsin's staff. They're separate. I mean, they do report to him. They're his. They change with the office, but it's another sort of thing. And then you have congressional agencies like the Library of Congress. Obviously, that's another sort of thing. It's very important to know who's the right person at the right time. So if you're talking about like a markup, you want to be talking with committee staff, because they're probably circulating memos about like, okay, here's how the party wants you to vote. Here's how internally what the issues are, et cetera. For some things you may want to be dealing, like if I want a question asked in a hearing, I want to go to a staffer for a member that I know is friendly to that issue, so that they'll put it in front of their boss and say, hey, here's a great question you should ask in this hearing. And if I'm down to the point of like, I want something passed and I need to get it through the Rules Committee in a particular way, then I want to deal with like either the Rules Committee staff or leadership staff to try and do that. So it's important to hit the right people at the right time.
So one thing that I wanted to say just while we're switching to questions, if you notice Alex and I giggling to ourselves up here sometimes, it was actually because we were very impressed by how much this resembled a real hearing. So technical difficulties, the ranking member and the chairman actually like elbowing each other and making fun of each other, very normal. And it was obvious that these two had testified before, which I didn't know. And I think he's testified in front of my committee, which made it even more hilarious. So anyway, that was some of that.
So in the last statement, this is a question to the whole panel. You mentioned right people at the right time. All 4 of you are here, obviously, because you have some interest, passion, or knowledge of the subject matter that we're discussing this week in Las Vegas, being cybersecurity, and specifically here, cybersecurity of connected cyber-physical systems. But what is your impression of the interest or knowledge across the rest of the Hill, not just the members, but also their staff, and whether or not their interest and knowledge is even relevant to passing working policy? I'm curious to hear your input on that.
I'd defer to Josh and Bo on that part. I'm more executive. My background was more executive branch, military and White House. And on that, I've been pleased, at least in what the folks at this administration has been putting in place. The new Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection, Chris Krebs, came out of Microsoft. He's been doing that for years. Jeanette Manfra, the Assistant Secretary for CS&C, solid. She gets it. They both care very, very deeply. Yep. Good networks, good colleagues, both well respected and well liked, which matters a lot in getting things done. Rob Joyce gets this. Tom Bossert gets this. One of our fellows from a former fellow from the Atlanta Council. So we're seeing good people that are going in on the executive branch side, and the things like cybersecurity, industrial control systems are not going to be magic to them, right? They get it, they understand it, and they're going to be starting to move that ship, hopefully, but we'll see.
So if I can speak about my experience with staffers and members, for that matter, this may be a somewhat unsatisfactory answer to the question, but I actually think they get it relatively well if you focus on what the it is. Mm-hmm. Because it for someone on the Hill is not the sort of things that, for the most part, we spend our time at BSides and Black Hat and DEF CON talking about. It's not technical issues. The policy level is fundamentally different. And I think at that level, the level of, I'm pretty pleased with the level of debate, actually, on these kinds of issues. I see Congress focusing on the kinds of things that Congress can make a difference about. And while I won't say that you have, hundreds of Hill staffers with the kind of technical knowledge that Jessica has, you are seeing increasingly people who have someone that they know to call. When they get some technical cybersecurity thing, like they know somebody in the community, even if it's not like their issue. So cybersecurity, my issue is 911. That's my big thing. Cyber's a part of that. It's a growing part of that, but it's not the biggest part. But there are folks who will call me even when it's not a 911 thing because they know I have that sort of security interest. And I think that's one of the powerful things about Am The Cavalry is, creating a sort of ready core of folks who can be that person that people call when they need someone who knows something.
Just to add to this, if you're sticking around for DEF CON, so there are several elected members in the House and Senate that have quite a bit of clue on cybersecurity. Not going to give an exhaustive list, but for our part, when we are on the Hill versus in the executive branch, we actually have 2 sitting members of Congress coming to DEF CON on Saturday and Sunday. Representative Langevin, a Rhode Island Democrat, who's the co-chair of the Cyber Caucus. I think the first time he saw the Idaho National Labs attack on critical infrastructure called Aurora, he asked a lot of questions and said, why aren't people more upset about this? And when he couldn't find a good answer, started the Cyber Caucus and has been very intellectually curious and asking lots of questions and getting very smart on this and has an incredibly good technical staffer in Nick Lyerson. The other member is Representative Hurd, a Republican from Texas, and he will be with us on a fireside chat as well. So there's some activities going on Saturday. I think it's the first time we've had sitting congressmen at DEF CON. There's also Ted Lieu of California, Senator Warner of Virginia. Quite a few people showing significant proactive interest in this. In general, though, when we don't have a specific topic that matches what they care about, we tend to go to committees of jurisdiction. So one of the reasons we know Jessica is her committee has jurisdiction over healthcare and, everything.
Not everything.
Automotive. But for a lot of the cyber physical systems, it tends to be a very good place to invest time and roundtables and discussion and research and make ourselves available. So I think it's a mix of who is self-identified as having clue or having very strong staffers, and who is on committees of jurisdiction for the things that we care most about. A lot of it, though, is we have absolutely no idea what we're doing, but it seems to be working. But I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mr. Ranking Member.
Yeah. Only thing I'd say is don't have an expectation, even if it's a reasonable expectation, that staffers are really going to understand the depth that you would need them to in order for them to have a real conversation about security with you, right? So I think I was one of the only staffers who I knew who actually did computer networking, and this blew people away. And honestly, the Capitol Police thought I had a bomb under my desk. I had a small 2 switches and a router, and that's it. And they were like, "What is that?" And it was interesting because all of the staff who work on security, internet policy, all sorts of things, they're talking with giant companies. They're talking with AT&T, Verizon, Alcatel-Lucent, T-Mobile. Well, not Alcatel anymore, but they get lobbied aggressively by people. Generally, the people who lobby know only a little bit more than the people who they are lobbying. Congressional staff are incredibly undercompensated. It's insulting how undercompensated congressional staff are. And so this creates a real challenge because you will not be talking with generally well-compensated tech workers who understand the challenges involved in, network function virtualization, right? The reason why Jess and I connected is because she is smart, and it was very rare, and I was very surprised. And so don't have an expectation that you can go in there and you can have a conversation about security architecture. Have an expectation that you can go and you can have a conversation about this is what we want to achieve, and let me make myself available to provide some advice. That's the best possible outcome.
One thing that I do want to do is give somebody sitting in the room a little bit of credit. So Travis Moore is the founder of Tech Congress. And so his goal is to get tech smart people into Congress. He has fellows who come in and they work for specific offices or specific committees, and they try and make us smarter on cybersecurity. So I think Travis really deserves a lot of credit for that.
So quick statistic, there are 12,000 staff in Congress, and I'm aware of 5 staffers that have any formal technical background.
Right.
Jessica is one of them. They're all in the House of Representatives. So we need good candidates because technology, security and technology underlie. It's not just traditional tech. It's health and it's finance and it's all of it's education. And so we have a 1-year policymaking fellowship. Fellows go in, they work directly for a member of Congress or committee, House Oversight Committee, Senator Wyden. They work on things like surveillance reform, encryption, investigating the OPM breach, health IT, really, really hardy, great work. So if you know good candidates, please send them my way. I'm giving you a little pitch here. It's a great role, and because there is this dearth of expertise, these fellows get to go in and work right at the front lines of these issues. So come find me after. It's techcongress.io, and would love help finding new recruits. We're going to start recruiting within the next month, and the application will close September 30th.
Yeah, and one point I wanted to make, which builds on Travis's quite nicely, is there may be 5 staffers who have a formal technical background. There are maybe 2 to 3 times as many of those people on the outside that congressional staffers feel really comfortable to turn to as an independent voice. And that's one of the best things that I've learned in coming to DC is I don't have to have a pile of money and a lobbyist in my pocket in order to go in and have a forthright and candid conversation about any of the technical issues or policy issues that I want to get across. It's more about being honest, being candid, telling the truth, and not running down a list of talking points or not particularly advocating for one thing or another, and tailoring my message to the level of the person that I'm talking to, which is especially important. You can start to see people's eyes glaze over when you get too in the weeds, and then you can pull up urgently, desperately to get back to some of the broader issues. But I think that's one of the most enlightening things for me is that Congress and agencies are very accessible. We've got lots of people from DC in the room, lots of people who had to get permission to come here, sometimes literally from an act of Congress to get on a plane to get here. Also, the second thing is how few people there are that they can actually turn to and feel confident in that. And for those of us who are doing it, it doesn't scale well. So right now, when there's only 5 people who kind of know who to turn to, having 10 or 15 who can answer their questions is roughly right. We want a lot more than 5, though. And we want a lot more of the people who don't have formal technical backgrounds to get a clue and to be able to reach out to people. So we need more people who those people can turn to ask really good questions. And sometimes that will be in DC. So that might mean that you might have to come for a visit or for a little longer than that, depending on what your appetite is.
So this is kind of related to that, but if somebody isn't in a position to move to DC or become a staffer, but they're interested in politics, they're interested in cybersecurity, what can they do to get involved in from all the way over from the West Coast and stuff? So
this is also not meant to be a shameless plug, but get involved with I Am The Cavalry. it's difficult if you're not immersed in DC culture to understand the importance of groups that you can turn to who have sort of a specific purpose. So I forget in particular who was mentioning it yesterday, but somebody was saying, it was Alan Friedman who was saying there are a lot of groups who concentrate on privacy, or there are a lot of groups who concentrate on healthcare issues or things like that. But there hasn't really been a security focused group like that, or a security research community focused group like that. And so in my perspective, over the last 4 years that I've been with Congress, I Am The Cavalry has really filled that role. So now when I need a security research focused perspective, what I do is I go to I Am The Cavalry and I ask, hey, what do you think? And then, they can, through their network, they essentially will put me in touch. I was saying yesterday, when I need somebody who understands automobile cybersecurity, I called Josh or I called Bo and I was like, hey, who do you know who's really smart on cars? And they'll give me a couple of names. Or who do you know who's really smart on medical device cybersecurity? And they give me a couple of names. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend get involved with I Am The Cavalry. The other thing that I would say is, we kind of get big heads with the federal government. We think we're the only government that matters. But your local and your state governments are incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important. In fact, that's arguably where more of the impact happens, is at the state and local level than at the federal level. So I would say get involved with your local and your state government. If you're smart, tech savvy, find out, do they need tech help? Do they need people who they feel like they can turn to in instances like that? So, take a look at local and state opportunities.
I want to echo that because this is something that we emphasize strongly with our members is be a resource for all of your elected representatives and all of your sort of administrative representatives. There was a great talk at ThoughtCon this year about hacking local government. And it was from the perspective of show up, offer to participate, and they're likely to hand you a job that actually has some impact on something. I mean, they'll put you in, I looked up after the talk, actually, I went back and I thought, well, okay, what does Alexandria, Virginia have? That's where I live. It turns out there's like 45 different boards that are populated by whoever showed up, right? and so, but they have nonetheless a big impact on the city's functioning. And the same goes at the state level. Like, there are lots of these sorts of things that you can do. It doesn't necessarily have to be with Congress. State legislators are just the same. I mean, my uncle's a state legislator in Tennessee, and knowing who to call for that particular issue is a huge deal, particularly when you don't have like a big personal staff the way a senator, a United States senator might. So that's one thing I would say. Get involved with I Am The Cavalry, but absolutely, state and local government hugely important.
So a ton of state legislatures are part-time, and beyond that, most state legislatures are incredibly underfunded for staff. And so they rely very, very heavily on literally anyone who will show up and talk to them. And this is terrible and also great, right? Because it's terrible because you've literally no idea the advice you're getting and it's impossible to vet it. But it's also great because if you're a smart, honest, thoughtful person, you can make a really big, important difference. The second piece, though, is that there's like 2 or 3 states that control an enormous amount of outcomes because of their weight. So like Texas controls all textbooks. Right? The State Department of Education controls what almost every other student in America reads. And California and New York control basically privacy policy. And so if you live in California and you have an opportunity to get involved and invested in that, or in New York or in other places, you can actually make a really big difference nationally. I would say, also, for example, like we're going to see GDPR roll out in the European Union, right, in the next, I think it's a year and a half. And that will fundamentally change the way that American companies deploy their infrastructure software services in Europe. And the same thing is true in the United States when California decides to make a decision. And so participation is the thing that's actually really important.
To kind of pile on there, the National Associations of the Commissioners, right? So the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, the National Association of, the Energy Commissioners, all those organizations are dying for talent as well, and where they get their information is questionable at best. So kind of the same deal with those organizations as well, especially as they write model law that just gets transferred into state regs, no questions asked.
And actually, maybe funnily enough, maybe if I can pile on to everybody piling on, one thing that's really funny about national policy sometimes is that when we start looking to implement national policy, what we'll do is we'll go look at like, hey, what did some of the states do? So we'll go pull up what the states did and we'll look at theirs, and then maybe we'll pick 5 that we think did good jobs and we'll synthesize those. So, if you work at the state level, sometimes you will have that follow-on impact because we'll base the national policy on what the state policy was.
Laboratories of democracy rise up.
Yeah, so and that's a wonderful point that you made about those groups. One kind of cool hack is just to go see where their annual conference is going to be the next year, and find out if that's near enough to you that you could get there, and something that is relevant to their community. Like me and like every other association, we're all desperate for content providers. Like if you want to come and talk about something and it looks like you might know something about it, fantastic. Please come and talk about this. And so what they'll probably say is you find the right person in the organization, like who handles security issues for NARUC or NACO or whoever, and then say, hey, I know something about this. I know a little bit about government. I'd love to come and talk to your members about it if they have an opportunity. Here's somebody who can verify that I'm not crazy. And a lot of times they'll say, great, yeah, I'd love to have you. Come on.
Just if anyone's interested, I gave that BuckOn talk.
It was great.
Thank you. So if anyone wanted to know more about local governments, I was in it for 5 years, heavily in it, and I'd be happy to talk to you one-on-one.
One thing that nobody's yet mentioned is all the national legislators have a local staff. And sometimes the local staffs can also be good places for you to go. And it's also, from what I hear, I've never engaged the local staff, but you just kind of show up and talk to them. And they're like, oh, wow, somebody really wants to talk to me.
Yeah, so that's actually a really fantastic point. So each representative this is the same thing in the Senate, I assume, but frankly, the Senate is like another universe to me because I work in the House of Representatives. But for each house, what Bo said is absolutely correct. Each House member has a DC staff and they have a district staff. So if you go find out who your House of Representatives member is, and then you go find out where their district office is, and you go talk to that district office, that's also a really good way to get involved.
I'll keep piling on as long as nobody else is. One of the things that's been one of the secrets to our success, and Jessica and Suzanne, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that we kind of started with the idea that we're going to go in and have honest, decent conversations on a peer-to-peer level rather than go in and just talk about all the things that we think are stupid or wrong or bad or whatever. And we led with empathy and understanding. We made an honest and genuine effort to invest in the people we were talking to. Yeah. And that paid huge dividends because it meant that, we didn't get a law passed on day one, right? But it meant that when there was something going on, we got a call. Or next time we were in town, we'd ping somebody, hey, grab a coffee and catch up. Interested to hear what you're working on. And that built a trust relationship over time that couldn't have happened in a single encounter, or couldn't have happened if we just came in with our issue and wanted to bang the drum on it. So some of it's just sitting there and listening and giving smart feedback in a time when you don't have anything particular that's on your mind, so that when there is something burning, you've got that connection already built.
So Congress takes regular breaks, which no one's surprised about. And so there's a month-long recess in August in which they're back in their district offices. And the calendar is very well published and publicly available. And so what you can always do is you can find out, okay, when is Congress on a break? Because that's the best time usually to engage staff at that point, because they don't have to handle or manage their boss like they normally would have to. I had a really great experience, and Trey and I've talked a lot about this, but I had a woman who literally fundamentally changed my life because she was incredibly giving of her time and her effort, and she was fully unrecognized for it, and she worked for the Congressional Research Service. Her name was Linda Moore, and she died a few months ago. But anyway, the output was, she had this very capable ability of breaking down really complicated topics very simply, and made an incredible effort to work with staffers and also with lobbyists and other people who work in public policy to help them understand some real ground truth. And so if you're really good at communicating complicated topics, the thing that you could do literally right now is you could find out who your member of Congress is, who the person is who handles that issue, and offer up as a resource like, hey, look, I would like to sit down and talk with you about the critical security control top 20 list. And we're going to talk through this, and I'm going to tell you what this means in English, right? And then ask questions of, hey, do you understand this? Do we need to have maybe some more conversation? Okay, great. You think you're cool? That's awesome. I'm going to go away, and in a couple of weeks, I'll maybe follow up with you with an email, and you build a relationship with that person. And honestly, because of people like Linda, like I went through engineering school and I run a company, and it's not because I did it on my own. It's because I had a lot of help.
So I'd like to associate myself with everything that the gentleman from Wisconsin just said. But I want to add, I think, and this is something, it always astonishes me, and I guess it's because at this point I've been around DC so long, but like the really pragmatic, mechanical aspects of how you interact with legislators and their staff are incredibly important. If you demonstrate a baseline understanding of like what their day looks like, that is worth so many brownie points. It's unbelievable. So just basic things like his point of, look for the recesses and call the staff when there's a recess on, when they don't have 19 different fires that they're putting out, 200 pages to write by the close of the day. And oh my God, their boss just voted the wrong way on this thing. And the whip's office is calling to find out what the hell just happened, right? I mean, that's their day. It's hair on fire from the moment they get there until the moment they leave when they're in session.
And fundraising.
And fundraising, right? Thereafter. So pragmatic things like for a meeting, most congressional offices are itty bitty. If you're going in for a meeting, show up on time. And by on time, I certainly don't mean late, because that's the next meeting. And I actually don't mean early either, because that's the meeting before. And expect your meeting to happen in a hallway or sitting in a couch in the middle of the lobby of their office, or at best sitting around a table with 8 other people in cubes right next to you who have their hair on fire, because that's how it works. Like, I mean, that don't be surprised about that. Be prepared for it and be ready to fit your pitch, whatever it is, the 3 most important things that you've got to say to them into that 15-minute window, because that's all you've got. And have a leave behind. This is the other thing. We always tell our members, no more than 1 page front and back, but have something to leave with them that has your contact information on it prominently so that they can get back to you. I like to use paper that is not white, so that when they think, oh God, where's that thing that guy gave me like 2 weeks ago, they can like shuffle through the gigantic stack of papers and go, oh, there's the one that's cream.
He's not joking. There's a stack of papers on the corner of my desk that's about that high, and I have to sort through it every couple of months because it starts to topple. But he's got a very good point. Yeah, I mean, just to pile on, because I am a current congressional staffer, and everything that everyone has said is very true. I think the biggest thing that I would recommend if you're trying to get involved with Congress, I know Bo and Josh say this a lot, is have empathy and be really patient with us. A lot of the times, politics gets very ugly, and for anybody who is paying attention to what's happening in DC right now, I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to be a staffer in DC right now. And the thing that I would say is just try and keep in mind, like, we're people too. And, so we do get really angry people who call us or write us angry emails yelling at us about how we're horrible people and we're doing horrible things and all these kinds of things. And I mean, like, we at a certain point, you're like, okay, this is my job, and I get used to it. But when you're coming in and you're very, very passionate about a topic and you really want to see us do something on it because you think it's incredibly important, just, bear with us. We've got tons and tons and tons of other things that are going on. We almost certainly don't understand the issue the way that you do. And the way that we have to look at it is slightly different. We have 7 other stakeholders who also think that the issue is very important and who are also coming in and talking to us about it. So, we kind of have to synthesize all that into one thing. So, sometimes I think people get discouraged because they feel like they get brushed off at the first or the second time that they try and talk to a congressional office. That's fair. But that's kind of what happens. So if you really want to have an impact, the best thing that you can do is just continue to be that resource. All right, you can't meet with me this week? Great. Here's 3 bullet points that I put together on this issue that I think might help you. And then you check back in a couple weeks later, and then you check back in a couple weeks later. You don't annoy them because you don't be too eager, but just that patience and that empathy for the plight of your underfunded congressional staffer would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I want to add one thing to that because, and this is the other thing that I think most people don't necessarily know or fully internalize. Alex and Jessica have both talked about the pressures on congressional staff in very real ways. I want to give another example. I have a very close friend who's a congressional staffer. His issue portfolio includes national security, animal rights, abortion, taxation, and health care. And he is expected at the drop of a hat to provide expert advice to his boss on every single one of those topics, no matter how narrow the question is. And the turnaround time for something is 30 minutes if you're lucky. Imagine doing that every day. I mean, that's the level. So that tells you kind of the depth at which people have to have mind modules that they plug in and take out. And if this is not the moment when your module is plugged in, forget it. Just leave the leave behind and get out of the way. I mean, that's kind of the reality of how compressed the congressional staffs are now.
Unless we've got any more questions, I wondered if maybe we could go around the room. We've heard a lot of pretty practical advice in the last 20 minutes. And if we could go around and maybe try and summarize, and I'll start. But the past couple of days have been pretty intense. I'll walk up to the front. The past couple of days have been pretty intense. We've had a lot of things going on. We've tried some things that were probably too crazy to work, and I think they managed to work out okay, like this crazy thing we did, turning hackers into Congress people, which I think was pretty fun. And so give it up for the panelists, first of all.